bought and gone. One Apache woman left, until a rancher claimed her. The sun rose slowly over the wide, dry plains, casting a golden light over the hills and rivers. Little Hawk woke before the light fully touched the land. She had learned to rise early, as the hours of darkness could be dangerous, and the world was not kind to a lone Apache woman. Her village, once filled with laughter, songs, and children running among the tents, had been gone for months. Every morning, the emptiness around her reminded her that she was alone. Every tree, every rock seemed to whisper memories of her family, and the pain of loss pressed heavily on her heart. She pulled her blanket closer, trying to hold on to the warmth, both of her small shelter and of the memories of her loved ones. Little Hawk was young but strong, her body lean from running, hunting, and surviving on the land. Her black hair fell in long braids, and her dark eyes were always alert. She had learned quickly that the plains could be beautiful, but they were also dangerous. Wolves prowled at night, and strangers sometimes carried weapons. She knew she had to move carefully, hiding her presence from anyone who might see her as weak or easy to take. The village was gone, but her knowledge of the land remained, and it was this knowledge that kept her alive. She remembered the day her village was taken. Soldiers had come in the morning, their horses stamping the ground and their voices shouting. Families were pulled from their homes, children crying and mothers trying to hold on to their little ones. Little Hawk had hidden behind a thick grove of trees, clutching her younger brother's hand, but he had been taken while she was distracted, and she had never seen him again. That day, she realized that the world outside her village was cruel, and that survival would demand courage, intelligence, and patience. For weeks, Little Hawk wandered the plains. She avoided roads and settlements, keeping to the rivers and hills where few people came. She hunted small animals, gathered berries, and drank from the streams. Each day was a test of her strength and willpower. She learned to sleep lightly, always listening for the sounds of horses or strangers. Sometimes she cried quietly into the wind, feeling the loneliness like a heavy stone in her chest. But she always forced herself to stand up again because giving in to despair would be dangerous. The seasons began to change. Summer turned to fall, and the nights grew colder. Little Hawk built a small shelter in a hollow near a riverbank, using branches and leaves to cover herself. She learned to make a fire that burned steadily without smoke, so that no one could see it from a distance. She started to notice the patterns of the animals around her, which birds flew where, and where the deer and rabbits liked to hide. Her days became a careful routine of searching for food, maintaining her shelter, and keeping watch. One morning, she saw smoke rising from far away. Her heart tightened. Doc. It could be another village, she thought. Or perhaps people were near who might want to capture her. She stayed hidden, crouched behind a hill, watching as the smoke drifted across the sky. She felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. For a moment she wished she could see a friendly face, someone who would not hurt her. But she knew that hope could be dangerous, and so she stayed quiet, moving only when she was certain no one was near. Despite the danger, Little Hawk sometimes found small joys. She liked to watch the sun rise and set, painting the sky with colors that seemed almost impossible. She listened to the wind rushing through the grass, sounding like music if she paid close attention. And at night, when the stars filled the sky, she remembered the stories her grandmother had told her. Stories about the spirits of the land and the bravery of their people. These memories gave her strength. Even though her village was gone, a part of it lived in her heart. But the loneliness was heavy. Some days she would talk to the trees and the animals as if they were her family. She whispered her fears and her memories into the wind. She imagined that the deer and birds understood her. that the river carried her words far away. Sometimes she would sit for hours by the river, thinking about the faces of her parents, her brother, and the children from the village. Tears would fall silently into the water, and she would wipe them away, telling herself that she had to keep going. Little Hawk also had to be careful about strangers. There were stories of people who bought or captured native people, selling them as laborers or servants. She had heard about villages being destroyed, families being taken away, and those who tried to run being caught. She did not know if the stories were true, but she had seen enough cruelty in the world to believe that she could not trust anyone easily. Every time she heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, her heart would beat faster. She would crouch in the grass, holding her breath, until the sound faded away. She also learned to use the land itself to protect herself. She could move silently through the brush, leaving no footprints, and hide in places where others would not think to look. She learned which berries were safe to eat and which plants could heal wounds or stop pain. She even learned to read the clouds and the wind, predicting storms and finding water in dry seasons. In this way, she felt a connection to the land that was deeper than fear or sorrow. It was her ally, and it helped her survive. One evening, after a long day of searching for food, Little Hawk sat on a small hill overlooking the river. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. She felt the weight of her solitude more than ever. She missed the sound of laughter, the smell of cooking fires, and the warmth of her family. She missed knowing that she was not alone in the world, but she also knew that if she gave up, if she stopped moving or thinking, she would not survive another night. So she tightened the blanket around her shoulders, stood up, and began walking along the river again. Little Hawk's mind often wandered to what her life could have been. She imagined her village still alive, children playing, and her family safe. She wondered if she would ever see anyone from her people again, or if she was truly the last. God. Sometimes she felt anger toward the soldiers, the settlers, and the cruel world that had taken everything from her. But other times, she felt a quiet determination. She knew that she could not change the past, but she could live for the future, however uncertain it might be. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Little Hawk grew more skilled at surviving, more careful in her movements, and more aware of the dangers around her. She had learned to recognize the difference between someone who might help her and someone who might harm her. She had learned to trust her instincts and to rely on herself above all else. She was alone, yes, but she was also strong, clever, and resourceful. One day she found herself near the edge of a settlement. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could hear voices and the sounds of animals. Fear gripped her, but curiosity did too. She crouched behind a hill and watched from a distance. The people looked busy, tending to their chores and moving quickly from one place to another. She realized that this was a world very different from her village, a world where she might not belong. But she also realized that if she wanted to survive, she would have to understand it. That night, Little Hawk slept in her usual hollow by the river, staring at the stars. She thought about the days ahead and what she might face. She knew that the world beyond the plains was dangerous, and that there were people who would not see her as a human being, but as something to be controlled or taken. Yet she also felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there were people who could see her value, who could recognize her strength and intelligence, rather than trying to take it away. As she drifted to sleep, she whispered a promise to herself and to the spirits of her people. She promised that she would survive, no matter what. She promised that she would remember her family and her village, keeping their stories alive in her heart. And she promised that she would not let the cruelty of the world take away her identity. She was the last of her people, yes, but she was not broken. She was Little Hawk, and she would continue to live, moving silently through the plains, learning, surviving, and remembering. The sun rose again the next morning, painting the hills with gold. Little Hawk opened her eyes, feeling the familiar chill of dawn on her skin. She packed her few belongings and began walking along the river, alert and cautious, yet determined. The world was vast, and danger lay in many forms, but she was ready. Alone she might be, but she was alive. And that meant she still had the power to face whatever came next. Little Hawk moved cautiously through the tall grass, her dark eyes scanning every movement, every sound. The plains were wide, and the river beside her gave her both comfort and danger. It meant life, water, and a way to find food, but it also meant that anyone traveling nearby could see her. She had learned that people often moved along the rivers because the water made the journey easier. And she had also learned that some of these people were not friendly. Stories reached her even in the quiet of the plains. Stories of traders and settlers who would take anyone alone, anyone they could claim. She had survived so far by being invisible. Her small frame, her quiet steps, and her careful observation allowed her to move without being noticed. But she also knew that her luck could not last forever. She had to stay alert. The world was changing fast. The settlers were spreading their land farther, and soldiers patrolled the hills and valleys. Little Hawk had no village, no family, and no one to warn her. She had to rely on her instincts, her knowledge, and her strength. One afternoon, she came across a small clearing. She crouched low and observed. A group of men on horseback rode slowly through the area, carrying supplies in wagons. Little Hawk's heart tightened. She could see them clearly now. Their clothes were different from anything she had seen in her village, and their voices were sharp, commanding, and unfamiliar. She remembered the warnings her parents had given when she was a child. Never trust strangers who speak loudly. Never let them see you weak, and always move quietly when danger is near. She stayed hidden, waiting for the group to pass. Her hands tightened around a small knife she carried, a gift from her mother. It was simple, but it gave her a small sense of security. The men spoke of buying and selling, of taking people from distant villages, and of how the plains were now open for their work. Little Hawk's stomach turned. She realized that these men were part of the dangerous world she had heard about, the world where people could be taken against their will. She pressed herself lower into the grass, silent, invisible, but listening carefully. The days grew colder, and Little Hawk had to move more often to find food and water. Rabbits, birds, and fish from the river became her meals, and she learned to travel long distances without leaving noticeable tracks. She could read the wind and the clouds, predicting storms and finding safe paths. But the more she moved, the more she realized that the settlers and traders were everywhere. The open plains were shrinking, and she had fewer places to hide. Fear became a constant companion, yet she did not let it control her. She had learned that fear could be useful. It kept her alert, but it could also paralyze her if she let it grow too large. One morning, as she rested near a grove of cottonwood trees, she heard the soft sound of hooves in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, blending with the shadows. A rider approached, alone, moving slowly and watching the land carefully. He was different from the men she had seen before. His horse was strong but not wild, and his movements were deliberate. Little Hawk did not know if he was a threat, but she could feel his presence like a weight on the earth. She stayed still, waiting to see what he would do. The rider stopped near the riverbank, dismounted, and began inspecting the water and the land around him. Little Hawk watched from behind a bush. He seemed to be a rancher, someone who worked the land, not a soldier or trader. He carried no weapons in his hands, only a long rope and some tools. There was a careful calm in the way he moved, a respect for the land that Little Hawk had learned to recognize in her own people. Yet she did not lower her guard. She knew that appearances could be deceiving. Days passed, and Little Hawk noticed that the man returned often. He seemed to travel slowly along the river, checking his cattle and observing the land. She kept her distance, watching from afar. She did not understand why he did not try to capture her or drive her away. She was wary. The world had taught her that trust was dangerous, and she had little reason to believe that anyone would treat her kindly. Still, she was curious. Something about the way he moved, the way he looked at the land, made her pause and think. Perhaps he was different from the others. As the weather grew colder, Little Hawk's need for shelter increased. Her hiding places were exposed to wind and rain, and food became harder to find. One evening, she made a decision. She would move closer to the man's ranch, not to confront him, but to observe more safely and perhaps find warmth and protection if she could. She stayed low, her movements careful and deliberate. She watched him as he tended to the land, repairing fences, guiding cattle, and moving with skill and patience. She realized that he respected the land, just as her people had taught her to do. Slowly, cautiously, Little Hawk allowed herself to think about the possibility of safety. Not comfort or friendship, those were luxuries she could not yet afford, but safety. The thought was strange and almost frightening. She had been alone for so long that any notion of trust felt unfamiliar. Yet she also recognized that the plains were growing more dangerous every day. Other men and traders roamed the land, and her resources were limited. Survival meant making choices, even difficult ones. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, she found herself near the edge of the ranch. She crouched in the grass, watching the man as he worked. He paused and looked in her direction, but he did not call out or approach her aggressively. Little Hawk felt a mixture of relief and suspicion. Perhaps he had seen her before and chosen to ignore her. Perhaps he was testing her, or perhaps he was simply a man who cared little for the presence of a lone woman on the land. Either way, she stayed hidden, moving silently and carefully. Over the next few weeks, a pattern formed. Little Hawk would watch him from a distance, observing how he worked the land and cared for his animals. She learned the routines of the ranch, the times when cattle were moved, when horses were fed, and when the man traveled to town. She began to understand the rhythms of his life, the way he respected the land, and the way he maintained order without cruelty. It was a different world from the one she had known in her village, but she could see a strange sense of justice in it. Yet danger was never far. She noticed other travelers passing through, some curious, some suspicious. She remembered the stories of those who were taken or bought against their will. Her stomach tightened at every noise, and she kept her knife close, ready to defend herself if needed. She had survived this long by being cautious, by understanding the land and its dangers, and by never trusting too easily. She would not let a false sense of safety lure her into danger. One evening she made a small fire at a safe distance and cooked a rabbit she had caught. She watched the flames, thinking about her journey and her loneliness. The world had taken so much from her, her family, her village, her people, but it had not taken her spirit. She was still strong, still capable, and still clever. She had survived against impossible odds, and she would continue to do so. The man on the ranch might represent a new danger or a new opportunity, but she would approach it with care, as she had learned to do all her life. Little Hawk also began to practice patience, something her people had always valued. She knew that rushing or acting too soon could lead to disaster. She observed quietly, waited for the right moment, and learned to blend into the landscape as if she were a shadow. She realized that survival was not just about strength or skill. It was about wisdom, caution, and timing. Each day she became more patient, more aware, and more confident in her ability to protect herself. The man on the ranch, whose name she would later learn was Samuel, continued his work without ever attempting to harm her. She did not know if he even noticed her at first, or if he simply chose to leave her alone, but Little Hawk began to sense that he might be different from the others. He did not move with the harshness or violence she had seen in soldiers and traders. He moved with purpose, respect, and care. And slowly she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she could survive near him, perhaps even learn from him, without being taken by force. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with orange and pink, Little Hawk sat quietly, hidden among the trees. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the losses she had suffered, and about the dangers that still lay ahead. She also thought about the possibility of life. Different, unfamiliar, but perhaps not entirely hopeless. She was cautious, yes, but she was also alive. And life, she knew, always offered opportunities for those who could recognize them. She stayed awake late into the night, listening to the sounds of the ranch and the land around her. The river flowed steadily, the wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Little Hawk felt the weight of her solitude, but she also felt the quiet strength that had carried her this far. She would continue to move, to observe, and to survive. She would be patient, careful, and wise, knowing that her life depended on it. Little Hawk had survived months of loneliness, fear, and danger. She had evaded capture, learned the rhythms of the land, and kept her spirit alive despite everything the world had taken from her. And now, as she watched the man on the ranch, she realized that her journey was entering a new chapter. She did not know what the future held, but she was ready to face it, with courage, with intelligence, and with the strength that had carried her through the worst days of her life. The mornings on the plains had a quiet rhythm. Little Hawk moved through the tall grass as always, but something had shifted in her careful routine. She had been observing the rancher Samuel for many days now. Each time he appeared, she noted the way he handled the cattle, repaired fences, and moved with steady, calm confidence. There was no hurry, no harsh words, no cruelty in his actions. Unlike the traders and soldiers she had encountered stories of, Samuel seemed different. He respected the land, and in some way, she sensed he respected her presence, even if he didn't yet understand it. Still, Little Hawk did not let her guard down. She had survived so long by trusting no one and remaining unseen. But she also recognized a practical truth. Survival sometimes required observation and, eventually, careful interaction. For weeks, she had stayed hidden, watching him from a distance, learning his patterns and predicting his movements. She now understood the daily flow of the ranch, the times when the cattle were moved, when the horses were fed, and when Samuel traveled to town. All of this knowledge gave her a sense of control, a sense that she could plan her next move carefully. One afternoon, a storm began to gather over the hills. The sky darkened, and winds whipped through the grass. Little Hawk crouched in her hiding place, pressed against a low ridge, watching the clouds gather. She could feel the tension in the air, and she knew the storm would soon arrive. The river beside her began to swell slightly, and small animals scurried for cover. She had faced storms before, but this one felt different, stronger, more threatening. She realized that she could no longer remain entirely hidden. She needed shelter, and the safest place nearby was the ranch. Carefully, She approached the edge of the property, keeping low and moving with the shadows. Samuel was outside trying to secure the loose equipment before the storm hit. He had not noticed her yet. Little Hawk's heart pounded. She was about to step into a space that could either be dangerous or safe. She reminded herself to move slowly, quietly, and deliberately, as she had been trained by necessity for all her life. As she came closer, a gust of wind blew her hair across her face. Samuel turned, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Little Hawk froze, unsure of how he would react. His expression was one of surprise, but not anger. He did not reach for a weapon or call out. Instead, he simply watched her carefully, as if trying to understand who she was. Little Hawk realized that this was a pivotal moment. Every decision she had made to survive, every careful step, every hidden observation, was leading to this encounter. "I won't hurt you," Samuel said slowly, his voice calm, not commanding or threatening. Little Hawk blinked. She had heard words like this before from strangers, but they often ended in lies. Still, there was something in his tone that felt different. It carried honesty, steadiness, and patience. She did not immediately respond, only watched him, ready to run if needed. Samuel noticed the small knife in her hand. He did not flinch or move quickly. Instead, he spoke again. "I see you've been living out here on your own. You must be very strong?" His eyes met hers, and there was no judgment, only recognition. Little Hawk was taken aback. He understood something she rarely found in others. He saw her strength. She did not lower her knife, but considered his words. Perhaps it was the first time in many months that someone had noticed her not as a possession or a target, but as a capable, living person. The storm began to fall, heavy rains soaking the land and turning the river into a rushing current. Little Hawk shivered, her body tired from long days without proper shelter. She realized she had a choice. She could run, as she had done countless times before, hiding in the hills and risking exposure to the elements. Or she could approach Samuel, at least for shelter, and hope that his words were genuine. After a long pause, she stepped closer, keeping her knife ready but relaxed. Samuel guided her to a small, covered area near the barn. It was not much, but it would keep her dry. He offered her a piece of bread and some water. Little Hawk accepted cautiously, drinking slowly, her senses alert for any trick. Samuel watched silently, giving her space but ready to act if needed. The storm raged outside, but in that small space there was a rare sense of calm. Little Hawk realized that survival sometimes required accepting help, even if only temporarily. Over the next days, Samuel continued to allow her near the ranch, though he never forced her to interact. He did not ask for explanations or demand obedience. He merely provided safety from the storms, food, and warmth when needed. Little Hawk observed him as carefully as ever, noting his routines, his habits, and his quiet fairness. She began to understand that he was a man who valued life, not just his own, but the life of the land, the animals, and perhaps even hers. During this time, Little Hawk began to learn from him in small ways. She observed how he handled the cattle, repaired fences, and moved around the property. He did not speak to her directly at first, but she watched closely, learning skills that could help her survive in this new world. She realized that survival did not always mean hiding. Sometimes it meant understanding, observing, and adapting. And slowly, she began to feel a strange sense of connection, not trust, not friendship yet, but awareness that she was no longer entirely alone. One evening, as the rain had cleared and the sun dipped behind the hills, Samuel spoke to her directly for the first time outside of the shelter. "You've been watching for a long time," he said. "I can see that you are clever, careful, and strong. I respect that." Little Hawk considered his words carefully. They were not flattery, nor were they commands. They were recognition, and recognition carried weight. She realized that he was offering something rare, a choice. She could stay and learn, or she could leave and continue surviving alone. She decided to stay, cautiously. Little Hawk helped in small ways, carrying water, feeding animals when Samuel allowed it, and observing quietly. She did not speak much, for she had learned that words could be dangerous, but her presence became part of the ranch, silent and respectful. Samuel never forced her, and gradually a rhythm developed between them. It was not friendship, but it was cooperation, and it allowed her to grow stronger in ways she had never imagined. Through these weeks, Little Hawk also began to feel the stirrings of something new. She had always lived for survival, never for comfort, companionship, or understanding. Yet being near Samuel, seeing how he respected the land and animals, and observing his quiet fairness made her realize that perhaps the world could hold more than danger. Perhaps there were people who could be allies, who could provide safety, who could offer guidance without taking control. She did not let herself hope too much, but the thought was there. At night she would sit by the fire or under the stars, thinking about her family and her village. She remembered the songs, the stories, and the laughter. She whispered the names of her parents and her brother into the wind, as she had done for months. But now the fear that had always pressed heavily against her chest felt slightly lighter. She had found a place to rest, a place to survive the storms, and perhaps even to grow. Samuel had not claimed her. He had only offered her a choice, and that choice made all the difference. Little Hawk's survival skills remained sharp. She still moved quietly, observed constantly, and remained ready to flee if danger appeared. But now, she also learned patience and trust in measured amounts. She realized that survival did not mean being entirely alone. It could also mean recognizing those who offered safety without threat. It could mean adapting to the world without surrendering her spirit. And in this, she felt a spark of hope she had not felt for many months. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed, and Little Hawk became more confident in her presence near the ranch. She continued to learn from Samuel, to observe quietly, and to contribute when she could. She did not speak freely yet, for her experiences had taught her caution, but she understood the rhythms of the ranch, the patterns of the land, and the ways in which she could navigate this new world. Samuel respected her space, her strength, and her independence, and in turn, Little Hawk began to see him not only as a man of the land, but as someone who could become an ally. One morning, Samuel left her a small bundle of food near her usual hiding place. There was no note, no demand, only sustenance. Little Hawk understood the meaning. It was an unspoken invitation, an acknowledgement of her presence, her skills, and her choice. She did not move closer immediately, but she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in months, a sense that she was seen, that she was recognized, not just as a survivor, but as a person of value. That night, she sat by the river and reflected on the weeks that had passed. She thought about the dangers she had faced, the storms she had survived, and the skills that had kept her alive. And she thought about Samuel, the rancher, who had observed her strength without trying to take it away. She realized that survival did not always mean isolation. Sometimes it meant recognizing those rare individuals who could coexist with you in respect and safety. And in this realization, she felt a small, cautious hope that she could survive not just physically, but with her spirit intact. Little Hawk did not yet fully trust Samuel, nor did she allow herself to feel safe completely, but she recognized the possibility that for the first time in many months, she had found someone who could offer protection, guidance, and respect. She remained watchful, careful, and ready to move at a moment's notice. But she also allowed herself to imagine a world where she did not have to run constantly, where she could learn, adapt, and survive in a new way. And as she lay under the stars that night, listening to the river and the distant calls of night animals, she whispered another promise to herself. She would survive. She would remain strong. She would remember her people, and she would carry their stories forward. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could allow herself to trust enough to see what the future might hold, if only she remained wise, careful, and patient. Life on the ranch began to take shape for Little Hawk, though it was very different from anything she had known. The land was vast and open, stretching farther than she could see, dotted with hills, rivers, and patches of trees. Samuel's ranch was busy, full of animals and work, yet quiet in its own way. Each day demanded effort, and each task carried a rhythm she had not experienced before. For Little Hawk, every sunrise brought both opportunity and challenge. She had survived alone for so long that relying on anyone, even Samuel, felt strange, but she was learning to adapt. Samuel had made it clear that she was free to move, work, or rest as she wished, as long as she respected the ranch and its animals. He never gave commands in anger or demanded obedience. Instead, he guided her, showed her, and allowed her to learn. Little Hawk had noticed that he was patient. He did not rush her, nor did he belittle her mistakes. At first, she observed from a distance, performing small tasks carefully, like carrying water to the horses or helping repair a fence. Every day she felt her confidence grow, though she remained cautious. The animals on the ranch were a challenge at first. The horses were skittish and easily frightened, and the cattle could be stubborn. Little Hawk had never worked with such creatures in the ways Samuel required. She had hunted and tracked animals for survival, but caring for them, guiding them, and understanding their patterns was new. She watched Samuel closely, noticing how he used quiet patience rather than force. "Animals respond to respect," he said one morning, noticing her hesitation. Little Hawk nodded, absorbing the lesson. She learned that strength alone was not enough. She needed understanding, observation, and calmness. Work on the ranch was not always easy. Long days were filled with feeding animals, mending fences, and walking through fields to check for problems. Some days she was exhausted, aching from muscles that had not known such steady labor. But for the first time she felt a strange satisfaction. Her efforts mattered, not just for survival, but for the life of the ranch itself. Little Hawk began to see that her strength and skills were valuable in this new world, even if it was different from the world she had lost. Samuel did not force conversation, but he spoke sometimes, in quiet tones that were easy to understand. He told her stories about the land, about cattle, and about the work it took to manage a ranch. Little Hawk listened, learning not only about the land but also about Samuel himself. He had grown up on this land, he said, and he had learned that patience, fairness, and careful attention were the keys to survival. She began to understand that, though he was different from her people, he valued similar lessons: respect, endurance, and understanding the world around him. Slowly, Little Hawk started to participate more. She would help guide the horses into the barn, feed the chickens, and even help with milking cows. Samuel watched her carefully, but never interrupted, unless necessary. He encouraged her without making her feel pressured. Each day her confidence grew, and she began to feel that she belonged, at least in part, to this land. She still remembered her village, her family, and her people, but she began to realize that survival meant adapting while keeping her identity alive. Evenings were quiet. After the work of the day was done, Little Hawk would sit near the fire, sometimes helping prepare food or watching the sky turn gold and red as the sun set. She had learned to appreciate small joys, the warmth of the fire, the taste of cooked food, and the sense of accomplishment after a long day. Life on the ranch was hard, but it was steady, and in its steadiness she found a strange comfort. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of security that went beyond merely hiding or surviving. Yet, life was not without challenges. Neighbors sometimes came to the ranch, strangers who were curious or suspicious. Little Hawk had to be careful in these moments. Samuel was polite and welcoming, but she could see the subtle glances and questions from visitors, the hints of judgment or curiosity. She learned to move quietly, to blend into the background, and to observe without being noticed. These skills, honed during her months of living alone, were still vital. Survival on the ranch required both adaptation and vigilance. Little Hawk also began to notice changes within herself. Her mind, once focused only on evading danger, was now learning planning, observation, and practical problem-solving in new ways. She discovered a sense of pride in her work, and even a sense of purpose. The ranch needed her skills, her awareness, and her strength. And though she remained quiet and cautious, she realized that she was no longer entirely invisible or powerless. Samuel respected her abilities, and in this respect, she felt something she had not felt in a long time: recognition. Occasionally, Samuel would speak to her about life beyond the ranch, about the town, about trading goods, and about traveling safely. Little Hawk listened carefully, absorbing knowledge that might one day protect her from dangers she could not yet foresee. She had always survived by instinct and observation, but now she was learning foresight, planning, and the quiet strategies that kept a ranch running smoothly. These lessons added to her strength and skill, giving her confidence that she could survive not just by fleeing danger, but by understanding and navigating it. Over time, Samuel began to rely on her more, though never in a demanding way. He allowed her to make decisions for small tasks, to observe and act independently, and to find solutions in her own way. Little Hawk discovered a sense of pride she had not known since her village. She was contributing, helping, and surviving with intelligence rather than only with strength or speed. Her work mattered, and that recognition brought her a quiet sense of joy. Even with these positive changes, Little Hawk's heart still carried sorrow. Memories of her family, her village, and her people returned often, sometimes unbidden. She would sit by the river or under the shade of a tree, whispering names, recounting stories, and feeling the ache of loss. But she had learned that grief could be a companion rather than a weight, as long as she did not allow it to paralyze her. These moments of memory became a way to honor her people, to keep them alive in her heart, even as she adapted to a new life. One day Samuel entrusted her with a larger task, guiding a small group of cattle back from a distant pasture. It was a test, not only of her skill but of his trust. Little Hawk accepted the responsibility carefully, moving with the animals, observing their movements, and guiding them with quiet gestures. She completed the task successfully, returning to the ranch with a sense of accomplishment. Samuel nodded, his eyes reflecting respect. It was one of the first moments when she realized that she had a place here, not as someone forced to obey, but as someone valued for her abilities. As the months passed, a quiet routine developed. Little Hawk woke with the sun, worked with the animals, learned from Samuel, and observed the land. She still moved cautiously among people, still remembered the dangers, and still relied on her skills for survival. But she had also learned that life could offer stability, that work could bring pride, and that recognition could be earned without fear. Samuel never demanded affection or submission. He only offered respect and the choice to remain. In this choice, Little Hawk found the possibility of a new kind of survival, one where her spirit and strength could remain intact. Little Hawk also began to see the small joys that life on the ranch offered. Birds sang in the mornings, the river flowed steadily, and the animals responded to her care. She could take pride in a fence repaired, a herd guided safely, or a task completed without error. Each accomplishment, small though it might seem, reinforced her sense of purpose. She realized that survival was no longer only about evading danger. It could also be about building, learning, and contributing. And in this, she discovered a quiet hope she had not felt in months. Evenings were her own time. She would sit by the fire, think about her family, and watch the stars appear. Sometimes Samuel would sit nearby working on tools or preparing for the next day, but he never interrupted her thoughts. She had space, respect, and a chance to recover from months of fear and loneliness. It was a life she had not expected, and it was slowly teaching her that survival could mean more than hiding. It could mean living fully, even cautiously, in a world that had once seemed determined to take everything from her. Little Hawk's journey on the ranch was still only beginning. Each day brought challenges, lessons, and small victories. She was learning to navigate a world that was not her own, while keeping the memories of her people alive. She was finding strength in patience, wisdom in observation, and pride in her work. And though she remained cautious, she began to sense that life on the ranch offered something rare. Not complete safety, but a chance to survive and grow with her spirit intact. By the end of the first year on the ranch, Little Hawk had transformed in ways even she could not fully measure. She was no longer only a lone survivor, hidden in the plains. She was a young woman with skills, knowledge, and confidence, able to contribute meaningfully to the ranch and to navigate the world with care. Samuel's respect had helped her see that survival could be more than endurance. It could be growth, learning, and quiet recognition. And in this, Little Hawk began to feel the first stirrings of something new. A life that, while different from her past, could still honor the strength, courage, and memory of her people. Seasons changed on the ranch one after another, and Little Hawk felt the rhythm of life settle into her bones. The harshness of her early days, hiding in the tall grass, fleeing dangers, and surviving alone, was still part of her, but it no longer defined her entirely. She had learned to live with purpose, to observe, and to act wisely. The land was familiar now, the animals responded to her care, and Samuel continued to guide her, never forcing her, never taking from her. Slowly, Little Hawk realized that life could hold safety, skill, and respect, even in a world that had once been so cruel. Yet memories of her people never faded. Each night, as she sat by the fire or gazed at the stars, she thought of her village, her parents, her brother, and the children who had once laughed among the tents. Their faces were etched into her mind, and she whispered their names into the wind, as she had done countless times before. These memories were bittersweet, painful reminders of what was lost, yet also a source of strength. She carried their stories in her heart, and this allowed her to survive not only physically, but spiritually. Samuel, for his part, never pressed her to speak of her past. He gave her space and patience, allowing her to share when she was ready, or to remain silent when she was not. This quiet respect helped Little Hawk feel a sense of control over her own life, something she had lacked since her village was taken. She began to understand that survival did not mean living in constant fear or hiding. It could mean living with dignity, intelligence, and care for oneself and others. As months turned into years, Little Hawk's skills on the ranch grew. She learned to guide the cattle, care for the horses, repair fences, and even anticipate problems before they arose. She became an integral part of the ranch's daily rhythm, and Samuel came to rely on her judgment. Her independence remained strong, but she had also learned cooperation, seeing that trust could be earned and respected without sacrificing her freedom. She felt a quiet pride in her work, a sense of purpose that gave her more than mere survival. It gave her meaning. Despite the stability, dangers of the outside world never entirely disappeared. Traders and settlers still roamed nearby, and there were occasional moments when strangers came too close to the ranch. Little Hawk's instincts remained sharp. She would move quietly, observe carefully, and keep her knowledge ready for defense if necessary. But unlike before, fear no longer ruled her life. She had learned that preparation, understanding, and skill could protect her, and that she did not have to be invisible to survive. She could live with awareness rather than constant terror. Over time, a bond developed between Samuel and Little Hawk. It was not a bond of ownership or control, but of mutual recognition and respect. Samuel had offered her choice, safety, and guidance without taking her spirit, and Little Hawk had responded with skill, diligence, and quiet trust. They understood each other in ways that words could not always capture. Samuel learned to recognize her quiet strength, and she learned to respect his steady fairness. Together, they created a rhythm of life that balanced independence and cooperation. Little Hawk also began to understand her own power. She realized that although her people had been taken from her, she carried their knowledge, courage, and traditions within herself. She would teach herself songs and stories, retelling them quietly to the animals or to the wind. In her small moments of solitude, she would dance, sing, and practice the rituals she had learned as a child. The land around her was no longer only a place of survival. It had become a place of memory and quiet connection to her people. She was the keeper of her culture, even alone. One evening, after a long day of guiding the cattle back from a distant pasture, Little Hawk sat under the shade of a cottonwood tree, feeling the cool breeze and the warmth of the sun on her face. She thought of her journey, the months of hiding, running, and surviving alone, and the years she had spent learning, observing, and adapting on the ranch. She felt a mixture of sorrow and pride. Her village was gone, her family was gone, yet she had survived. She had endured the harshest tests of life and emerged not only alive, but stronger, wiser, and more capable. Samuel joined her quietly, carrying a small jug of water. He did not speak at first, allowing her space, but he sat nearby, close enough to share the moment without intrusion. After a few minutes, he spoke softly. "You have grown strong, wise, and careful," he said. "The land and the animals respect you, and I do as well. You have endured more than most could imagine." Little Hawk nodded, understanding the weight of his words. They were not praise in the way she had known it as a child. They were acknowledgement, a recognition of her endurance and skill. In the years that followed, Little Hawk continued to grow in confidence and ability. She learned to anticipate storms, to guide animals through difficult terrain, and to manage her own small tasks on the ranch without instruction. Samuel allowed her space to make choices, to act independently, and to demonstrate her capabilities. Little Hawk understood that her survival was no longer just about hiding, fleeing, or enduring. It was also about contribution, observation, and quiet leadership. She was not only surviving, she was thriving. Yet even as she thrived, the memory of her people remained a constant presence. She told herself their stories, remembered their songs, and practiced their rituals, ensuring that the essence of her village remained alive within her. She understood that though she might be the last of her people in the plains, their memory could endure. Each act of survival, Each lesson learned, each story remembered, was a way of honoring them. She had become a living archive, a bearer of her people's legacy. One spring morning, Samuel entrusted her with an important task, managing the ranch for a few days while he traveled to town. Little Hawk accepted, her mind alert, her instincts sharp, and her heart steady. She guided the animals, managed the daily chores, and ensured that the land remained cared for. When Samuel returned, he found everything in perfect order. He smiled, a quiet, steady smile, and nodded. Little Hawk realized that she had not only earned his trust, but that she had proven to herself the depth of her own abilities. She could survive, lead, and thrive, even without constant guidance. Over time, Little Hawk found a balance between memory and adaptation. She continued to honor her people through rituals, stories, and songs, while also living fully in the present, contributing to the ranch and navigating the wider world with skill. She understood that survival was not only about physical endurance, it was also about spirit, memory, and the courage to adapt. Samuel's guidance and respect allowed her to grow in ways she could not have imagined during her months alone on the plains. As she matured, Little Hawk also began to think about the future. She realized that survival could extend beyond herself, that she could teach others about the land, about care for animals, and about resilience. Though she remained the last of her village, she could carry forward its lessons, its stories, and its strength. She could ensure that her people's spirit endured, even in a world that had once tried to erase it. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, Little Hawk sat quietly on a ridge, overlooking the plains. The wind moved through her hair, and the sky glowed with orange and gold. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the months of fear, hiding, and loss, and the years of learning, observation, and growth on the ranch. She felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. She had survived not only the dangers of the land, but the loss of her family and village. She had adapted, learned, and honored the memory of her people while building a life that allowed her spirit to remain strong. Samuel joined her again, standing a few steps behind. He did not speak, simply observing the land alongside her. Little Hawk understood the significance of this shared silence. They had created a rhythm of life together, one built on respect, recognition, and careful balance. She had learned to trust cautiously, to survive independently, and to thrive with skill and dignity. And in this silence, she felt the quiet joy of accomplishment, endurance, and hope. Little Hawk knew that the world would continue to change. She knew there would always be challenges, dangers, and the unknown, but she also knew that she had grown strong, wise, and capable. She had faced the worst the plains could offer and survived. She had adapted without losing herself, learned without surrendering her spirit, and endured without giving up hope. Her journey had been long and difficult, but she had emerged not only as a survivor, but as a living reminder of her people, their strength, and their memory. In the quiet of the evening, she whispered the names of her family into the wind, feeling their presence in her heart. She had survived storms, dangers, and isolation, and she had found a way to live fully in the world that remained. Little Hawk realized that life could hold both sorrow and joy, memory and adaptation, loss and growth. She understood that survival was not only about escaping danger, it was also about building, contributing, and honoring what had been lost. And as the stars began to shine over the plains, Little Hawk stood tall, strong, and unwavering. She was the last of her village, yes, but she carried its spirit forward. She had found safety, purpose, and respect. She had endured the impossible, adapted to a new world, and preserved the memory of her people. And in this balance, she discovered the quiet, enduring truth of survival, that even when everything is lost, the strength of the heart, the wisdom of experience, and the memory of those we love can guide us, sustain us, and allow us to thrive. Little Hawk turned back to the ranch, ready to continue her life, ready to face whatever challenges might come, and ready to honor the legacy of her people in every step she took. She was alive, she was strong, and she had survived. And in surviving, she had preserved not only herself, but the memory and spirit of all who had come before her.